Everyone, it's the Motivators podcast here, and I'm Emily McCullough, the Chief Clinical Officer at Motivity, and we also have Brian here.
Hello.
Brian Curley, Chief Creative Officer, and we have a guest today, Allyson Wharam from Sidekick Learning. We want to learn a little bit about her work, and Allyson, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what led you to start Sidekick Learning?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here chatting with both of you. I am Allyson Wharam. I am a behavior analyst at BCBA, but I am also an instructional designer by training. And so my passion and love is really combining both of those worlds in, looking towards the future of behavior analysis and how we can really impact things on a larger level. I just saw from the very beginning, even as a technician, I remember seeing there are just so many gaps and opportunities really for improvement as a field. So as I mentioned, I am an instructional designer. So I have a master's in instructional design from UVA, and I'm finishing my doc program there, hoping to be done in the next year. And then also as a behavior analyst, have done a lot of work in public schools, but also telehealth, adult services, clinical services, in-home. So kind of the gamut of a lot of the typical applications of ABA. And then we do a lot of supervision as well, remote supervision and things like that. So I started Sidekick Learning very early in 2022 after seeing, in particular, again, that gap in terms of training and supervision of behavior analysts. In terms of training, just difficulty in finding high quality training, but also I had previously served as a training coordinator for an organization that was across the state of Virginia. And in that role, we were kind of repeating the same training over and over again. It just wasn't a very efficient use of our time or the best use of the folks' time who were traveling to the central office to do all of that from far away. And so that's when, and that was long before 2022, my wheels kind of started spinning. And then as a practicum supervisor at a university, seeing again gaps there in terms of the resources and things like that. And so really just seeing a lot of opportunity for how we could support supervisors, how we could support behavior analysts, how we could support technicians, and then the impact that has on those folks, but also the people that they go on to serve. And so that's kind of what inspired me to start our organization. And we've continued to grow. We really started out focusing on supervision as that first kind of area to address. And then we recently launched our RBT training and have a full service learning management system that organizations can use. So that's where we are, and have, a lot of places we still want to go, but that's kind of the quick spiel of, or maybe not so quick, but where we've been and where we're going.
So your background, I'm kind of interested in, because I did a bachelor's and a master's in graphic design. My master's was in design pedagogy. So
interesting.
But it was more about teaching design in a certain way and figuring out how different people learn in different ways and all that stuff. So how much of yours was kind of like, I guess, what was that training like? Like, what was the master's and what's your current doctorate like? Like, is it more around the psychology, which I see you have like a bachelor's in? So is it more of that now, or is it more like, transferring that knowledge to something like software?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of everything, mostly the design component of the instruction itself. So some of it, we have classes on like instructional materials design. So making sure that that's like graphic design super light in terms of like, how do you communicate things clearly, but also, a lot of it can be easily translated into behavior analytic principles as well. Like, how do you highlight the most relevant information on a slide? How do you make sure that the right things that you're communicating and chunking information and scaffolding it and, building things up, shaping all of these things that we use as behavior analysts. But also, there's a little bit of kind of that graphic design piece to make sure that you're communicating well, but really it all still comes back to, I guess, more of like the psychology and the behavior of it, of how do we design things and create things towards that ultimate goal. It's all backwards design. What do we want people to do with it? Same thing we do when we program for our clients. What do we want them to be able to do? And then you work backwards from there, and you're going to change things and make changes as you go to reach that goal. But that's kind of the focus. Yeah.
Yeah. There was a really good book I read a long time ago now. Well, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, that did this exact thing called the Checklist Manifesto.
Oh, yes. I have.
You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, it's like this big. It's a day read, and it goes through all, like whittling down like, the importance of a checklist item and what it needs to include, and does it need to be robust, and then all the data behind it, and how it, like is that kind of like in essence what you're doing?
Yeah. So a lot of it is just how do we distill information down? How do you make it whatever needs to be salient? There's a lot more to it than I think people realize. It's kind of similar to how when you're, I think a lot of us encounter this as behavior analysts. You encounter behavior all the time. Or others encounter behavior all the time. So it's easy to say, well, I would just do this, or this person says to do this, even though you don't have a lot of background in it. Same thing with training. We are all exposed to a lot of training. So it's easy to just say, I can create that, or I can do that, or I can throw that into a PowerPoint. And not to minimize the work that, anyone else is doing, but there is a lot to it when you look underneath the hood of really being intentional about that, and what you want people to do at the end of it. I think that's one of the biggest things we always try to focus on is not what do we want to communicate, but what does that person need, and what does that person need to be able to do with this information, and then we design around that, which also relates, we kind of, in my program at least, has this dual focus on human performance technology, which is essentially OBM, and how they relate to each other. Like, is this even a training issue in the first place? Could it be solved with just a checklist? Could it be solved with some other, like a job aid or another support, or a performance intervention, not even a training sort of related intervention? So that's kind of the other side. And again, kind of looking back at the roots of our field, a lot of, like, even in my program is not behavior analytic, but when we look back at who some of the, they're talking about Skinner and Keller and programmed instruction and personalized systems of instruction and all of those things. Even if you look at, like, Tiemann and Markle are a good example of behavior analytic instructional designers who also lived in that world. So there's a lot of overlap that I think people don't realize in terms of that traditional, on both sides of the fence. Like, traditional instructional designers aren't thinking about the fact that they're doing behavior analysis, and also sometimes, as behavior analysts, we don't realize our roots in these outside fields and how that's influencing things. I think Carl Binder's another example on more of the performance side of someone who's in that human performance technology world, or more of that performance improvement, but also OBM, and kind of one foot in both worlds.
Yeah, or Guy Bruce. Guy Bruce has a lot of instructional design stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. You and I have very similar backgrounds. I started Autism Training Solutions, which was a learning management system. So when I did that, I had to go back to school to learn different instructional design theories, and I was really it was really eye-opening to see all the different learning theories outside of behavior analysis. I was just wondering, what are some of the other learning theories that you have really liked to learn about, or really adopted into your way of using the science?
Yeah. So a common thing that you'll see referenced is the ADDIE design model. It's kind of a distilled version of another design model, which is by Richard Clark. And so that model is just kind of looks at the iterative nature of design. I think that's a really good framework for looking at the fact that you're never done. You're kind of going, you're constantly going back through and iterating, but you're also basing things on needs. So everything should always start with a needs assessment and not just, again, what you want to teach. It's really easy when you go to design a training to say like, oh, there's this cool thing and this cool thing and this cool thing. And then it just becomes this collection of interesting things, but interesting things that don't actually lead to performance change. And so that's a really helpful model. There are a couple of other kind of similar models around like the design process. Another really helpful one, I mentioned Tiemann and Markle. Tiemann and Markle are great for really that behavior analytic look at instructional design, whether you're designing for adult learners or children. And there's this kind of scary looking matrix that they have, but it's really not. But it really looks at how we're building to these complex repertoires. Like we start with an individual response and then we build to behavior chains and so on and so forth, rather than, if you're teaching a task analysis, for example, we're not going to start with that whole behavior chain. We need to make sure that they have all of those individual responses. Same thing with, do they understand the individual concept before you go to rules and principles and how they're applying all of those things? That's a very simple overview, but it really is a great way to look at kind of scaffolding instruction. And then, there are a couple of others. I would say the other, I could list a million that are just really helpful. But the Mager or Major, I hear it said both ways. I always want to say Mager, but I think it's actually Major, Mager. The 6-pack there that's my like number one go-to. It's not really a model, but there are models embedded throughout, but it has the whole gamut of analyzing the goals of what you're doing, to designing the actual instruction, to analyzing performance problems. It's a set of 6 books that aren't huge, but they all are just full of information. And again, a good bridge between both of those worlds. There's something that is used by behavior analysts, but also in more traditional circles.
Very cool. Why don't we talk a little bit about how this has led to this, you starting Sidekick Learning. Tell us exactly what Sidekick Learning is and what you guys provide for the ABA community or outside. I'm not sure if you also provide outside services to outside the ABA community as well.
Yeah, so we are really focused on behavior analysts and their training right now. And so, like I said, we started with supervision, again, looking at supervision as really this instructional process where we're looking at specific performances and what does a trainee need to be able to do at the end of their supervision. So much is left to individual supervisors whose own experience was left up to their individual supervisors. And so it's just, there's so much variability, and the research shows us that. There's not a lot of research, but there are a couple of surveys, one by Sellers et al., which I think is 2019 was her survey. And then Hajiaghamohseni, I don't know how to say her last name. If I have it pulled up, I can like kind of phonetically do it. And so I apologize for butchering that. I think hers is 2020, but also another survey looking at the practices of supervisors, and a lot of variability there, which makes sense because a lot of supervisors are doing that on top of all of the other responsibilities that they have. And then they're also tasked with this huge responsibility of, we have the mentorship piece, we have the supervisor or the supervisee working with the individual clients and how you're shaping things around that. But what do they need to be able to do at the end of that? And if we leave it all to chance, you can really come out of your supervision with a really scattered skill set. And I found that both as a trainee, but also as a supervisor, trying to give that to my folks that, 1,500 hours or 2,000 hours seems like a lot of hours. But if you're not really intentional about what you're doing during that time and making sure that you're accounting for all of that, you can get to the end and it's just, you haven't done all of the things that you need to do. And not that you can do all of the things, but there are some pivotal skills that we need to make sure all of our folks have. And so that was kind of that first thing that we focused on and still do a lot of, was creating a structured curriculum that is designed to be very flexible so that you can adapt it to these individual circumstances, but that supervisors had a lot of resources at their fingertips for recommended articles, for application activities, for rubrics, for how to score things, for tracking how their trainees were progressing, all of those sort of things. And then having that as a tool also for the trainees to be able to go in and have this kind of resource bank so that I really valued my supervisors and my supervision, but a lot of it was left up to me to go and find things, and which is okay to a degree, but also giving someone a set of tools that are already kind of vetted, that you already know or are able to trust, I think as a supervisor and as a trainee is really helpful, because sometimes as a trainee, you don't have the ability to vet all of those things or to even know where to look when it's brand new. So that was kind of the first thing that we really focused on. And then we now, like I said, have started our RBT training and have gotten really great feedback on that. We just finished up a beta testing round. And so far, it's met a lot of our goals for what we were hoping to provide in terms of being a little bit more engaging, being more accessible in terms of being more up to date, but also like breaking things down, not just having an hour of a lecture, but really looking at how do we break down the concepts in the way that people actually learn, and having them actually interact and engage, not just, again, watching a video, but practicing and applying those things. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And then we also have kind of a full service learning management system to help organizations as they can create their own training content and track their progress and all of those things.
Yeah, I believe we have staff that went through your beta RBT training,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think,
Very cool.
Yeah.
That was really nice of you guys to offer that. And I guess for the audience that's not familiar, could you explain what is a learning management system?
Yeah, great question. It's easy when you're in all of, this world to kind of gloss over those things. You'll also hear it, just people call it an LMS. So if you see that acronym thrown around, a learning management system, and essentially it's your content delivery system. So there are kind of two different sides of like actually creating the instruction, which you can do sometimes within a learning management system. But the learning management system itself is the delivery of that content. And so we really have focused on e-learning or the online learning side of things and how to deliver that content in a way that is efficient. And that's what a learning management system helps you to do. So if you have someone going through the RBT training, you have all of those resources and materials and things like that right there. Same thing with the curriculum. There are some really fantastic books and things out there, but our curriculum is all online, hosted in the learning management system, because it allows us to make constant updates, to revise, to make things interactive, to embed quizzes, all of those different things. So a learning management system is kind of that where you go to actually interact with the content as a learner. And then as an administrator, it's your system for delivering that content and for tracking how your people are progressing, how they're scoring, all of that.
Very cool.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Is the RBT training, is that one actually, do you have to do any accreditations or anything like that with the new trainings that you have coming out? Or are these just kind of like side learning before they take the exam?
Yeah, so this is the 40-hour course. So one of those like core requirements before you're able to actually become an RBT. And so we are an ACE provider, but that's kind of separate actually from the RBT training. But you do have to design it according to the RBT task list and specific requirements. So the BACB actually, I think we had to do a pretty big pivot because it came out during our development for the 3rd edition task list, and some changes they've created a 40-hour curriculum outline that specifies a certain number of hours in each area and things like that. So you have to follow all of those requirements. And
So you
yeah.
kind of got in and customized each one on the task list and kind of said, like, taking each one as a whole and said, how can we optimize this one?
Yeah. So yeah, looking at that content and really thinking about, okay, if it's whatever concept it is, it's not just how do we teach the underlying pieces of this, but also teach it in such a way that they can translate it, they can practice it.
I saw on your website your one of your values is immersive learning and practicing. How do you do that through an online platform?
Yeah, so it's tricky, and you have to acknowledge the limitations of online learning as well. I think it can get a bad rap in terms of in person is always better, or whatever it happens to be. And there are actually frameworks for that and thinking about that. The research actually does demonstrate. There's a lot of research that shows that it's not about the modality. It's not about if you're online or in person. It's about the actual instruction and the instructional procedures. I think a lot of us can probably think back to college when you were in a lecture hall with 200 people and just sitting there and listening, and you were in person, but was that more effective than being online, for example? And then you have a lot of interactivity, a lot of ability to maybe communicate or collaborate with other people, whatever it looks like. And again, there are frameworks for kind of thinking about that and thinking about the affordances and constraints of whatever modality or system you have. Meaning, there are certain things that you can do in an online system, for example, that you can't do in person. And there are certain things that you can do in person that you can't do in an online system. And evaluating for those things and designing around them and trying to mitigate the barriers as much as possible. So long story short, what we have done to kind of think about that is we are really, first off, the people that are going through the training have a workbook that goes alongside it. So they have all of the visuals and things like that provided to them so that they can kind of carry that with them and translate it out into the field. With that, there are also spots for them to write down what questions they have, things like that, so they can bring it to their supervisor for follow-up. Within the system itself, it's giving them a lot of feedback in terms of how they are performing on different quizzes and things like that. They're actually taking data and practicing taking data in the system. They're actually, watching videos and, talking about, okay, here is how this person contrived demand and things like that. So we've tried to program around that as much as possible while also acknowledging some of the limitations. And our next step in helping to transfer this and really make it usable for organizations is having additional supplementary materials for on the ground trainers as well, to be able to kind of say and bring that into practice, whether it's shadowing in the field or actual BST. With having a supervision curriculum for BCBA supervision for that piece, we're translating that to RBT supervision as well. Acknowledging also that even if you're in person and you're practicing all of those things, that's a lot to learn at one time. No one is becoming fluent in 40 hours. It's just the reality of it. And so having that ongoing curriculum as well, where they're able to measure the fidelity of, whatever procedure it happens to be, where they're able to discuss the important concepts and things like that. And giving the supervisors the tools to kind of navigate that within supervision on an ongoing basis as well is something that we've really kind of tried to incorporate.
And you're constantly, like, I think you mentioned this earlier, but you're constantly like optimizing and evolving these courses. Like, are you looking at, wow, everyone's crushing this, but this one section, we see a dip, what's wrong there? Like, are you constantly doing stuff like that?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So that's been really the main focus of our beta testing period, like front loading a lot of that. But also we're not done doing that when the beta testing period is over. We're constantly evolving and changing and updating those things and responding to feedback on both sides. That's, another one of our values is just being constantly improving what we're doing. And that, learning is never done, or learning design is never done. We're always changing and iterating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's nice. And then So on the technology side, did you build this LMS from scratch, or did you use something else? Like, are you like, it must be nice to be on both sides of the fence there, right? Like you're not kind of being, hamstrung by the platform's capabilities to do what you want to do.
Yeah. So for right now, actually, we are using an external LMS. We have vetted. It was a very long and intensive process because there are many, many out there. Yes, I'm sure you have looked a little bit. And so there's a lot. And again, back to that affordances and constraints piece, you have to look at that with every single LMS because they're all designed so differently. And it was like a multi-year process we started with kind of a very light version to kind of get things out there and get things moving before we found our current LMS that we're using to deliver content. And even then we work really closely with them. They're very receptive to feedback in terms of how they're iterating and improving. And so that was something we looked for, was an LMS that was also going to be responsive to kind of the needs of their customers as well. So, but even within that, a lot of these LMS, they're not really turnkey. Like you're not able to just kind of take it at face value and run with it. In many cases, you have to do a lot. One of our because our users can actually create their own content and things like that. Someone made a comment recently. I see how much work you guys had to do to make the RBT training what it is, that it wasn't just throwing a couple of videos in there and calling it a day, that there's a lot that has to go into the design of all of that. So yeah, and we use a lot of other technologies then to build the instruction that's embedded in there. There's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah. There's the content software. I can't remember what those are called now. It's been a minute.
Like an authoring tool.
Tool. Those are the authoring tools that sit within the learning management system. And it's so many layers people don't realize. And there's so many organizations that they're like, oh, we're behavior analysts. We know how to teach things. Just let me get this LMS and we can do it.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, it's not that simple. And especially because, like you said, a lot of learning management systems are not behavior analytic. You're not going to have some of those tools where you're like, well, I want to be able to put like a personalized, like PSI type of functionality here where they have to like respond to the interverbal at this moment of time. Like the learning management systems aren't designed that way. So you kind of have to be creative.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and even like there's the skill component, but there's also just sheerly the time component, the time that it takes to really design.
Yeah.
And even if you know what to do, sitting down and just recording a video of you talking for an hour takes a lot less time than designing an hour of really broken down interactive and instructional content. That can take, 20 times that, 30, 40 times that. So just depending.
And the research is so interesting. I because of my background, I was able to participate in a lot of these research
interesting.
studies.
Yeah.
And, compare it, like you said before, the modality really is not a huge differentiator. Like we did a study where we compared a interactive video. So it was on back injury, how to prevent back injury for when you're lifting people, when you're working with people with disabilities. So we showed like videos, just like video modeling. And then we had PowerPoint with pictures. And then we had this really complex video interaction where you had to like actually click on the video at the right time when they're doing it correctly. And we compared all three of those modalities, and there was no significant change in actually completing the activity correctly. And you would think right? You would think the one that has the more precise, action that you have to do would come out with a better outcome. But of course, it was one study, so It's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. But yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there have been like meta-analyses done and not like you would think that this is like very recent and that people don't know about it for that reason, but there are meta-analyses and things back from like 2010 and things like that. And this in instructional design, there's this the great media debate is what it's called, and I'm pretty sure it was like the 70s or 80s where they were having these conversations about the medium versus the message and all of that. And so yeah, so it just really yeah, I think it's something that I think even as we're thinking about like online programs in behavior analysis versus in-person programs and things like that, it's tempting to reduce it to that as the issue, when really there's a lot more nuance there. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, do you guys remember there's this time where Delta, I think it was Delta or an airline came out with their initial like safety video, but they did it in a very like humorous way. And then all of a sudden, like all of the airlines were doing these videos. And that was about the time that I created my company. So I kind of like thought this must be the way people learn. Like people learn through humor and stories, right? And there is evidence of that. So you know, the trainees that we created, we put a bunch of humor and like stories that were funny or kind of almost like office humor where it's a little like awkward type of stuff.
Yeah.
And you know, it really, people liked it. I think like the participation and the scores of satisfaction scores were higher, but the test scores were no different than before.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because you need to have engagement, right? But engagement is research shows that engagement is a pretty poor proxy of learning, actually. So, like, just because someone is engaged, you need to have engagement for learning, but just because someone is engaged does not mean that they're learning. Like, you can have something that is really interesting or fun or like attention catching or moving or whatever it happens to be. And that can help learning, but it doesn't mean that they're learning.
It's my Duolingo. That's Duolingo.
Yeah.
It's a whole.
Yes.
You got me to do it, but I cannot speak the language.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. So yeah, I think that's a common. But again, it's important, and it's important, you know, and there are other ways to do that too, in terms of like, how are we looking at like the research, for example, on like the length of time that someone can even feasibly stay engaged. So we were talking about like hour-long videos or something like that. And really the research shows that it's really closer to like 5-10 minutes-ish of content at a time before you kind of need to shift gears a little bit, which makes sense. And, you know, I think, yeah, even for adults, I think it's easy to assume like, okay, well, these are like maybe more gimmicky things you need to do for kids, but for adults, it's still important for them to be engaged or to be entertained and have all of this. But also, you know, how are we designing the instruction for that outcome too?
Tell stories. I mean, I think the one of the things that stuck with me the most in my instructional design classes and stuff is like, you have to find what is motivating for them. I mean, this is behavior analytic. What's the MO?
Yeah, what's the MO?
Why should I know this? Right? Like, that's why they show videos, like teenagers videos of kids that have been in drunk driving accidents, right? Why should I listen to this message you're telling me right now? And then embedding that in instructional design. I mean, not to that traumatic degree, but yeah, that was super.
Yeah. I mean, eliciting that emotion, like back to that Tiemann and Markle matrix, we were talking about the underlying layer of all of that is emotion, essentially, and how all of that influences learning, how we're approaching learning, that MO. What are we bringing in terms of that to, you know, how we're engaging with whatever we're learning.
Yeah, I remember taking those classes and feeling like I was like a cheating girlfriend or something. What with this with like this Canarian method, you know? Like I like emotion and like really feeling like that makes a lot of sense. But behavior analytic is, and I think now it's less black and white than when, early 2000s, 2010s. Behavior analysts are a lot more nuanced in terms of emotion and internal behavior. But anyway, I was like, this makes sense, but
it is. You have to kind of shut off that part of your brain to be receptive and open, I think. And what's interesting is like that comes from Tiemann and Markle, who are behavior analysts, but it's like from, I think probably the 90s. I don't know exactly, but it's almost like, I think in some ways we kind of overcorrected maybe in some of the 2000s and things where we became so almost methodological again and are kind of finding our way back. But yeah, I mean, my program is situated in just like a traditional school of education. And so I definitely I think I am much better for it. I'm a better behavior analyst for it. I'm better at communicating and being open to new ideas. But it was hard at first to kind of be receptive to some of those things or some of that language that I was kind of trained to shut down or like not believe as valid for a long time.
Yeah. So bring it back a little bit to your timeline real quick. So you're still a practicing BCBA?
So go ahead.
So you were, I'm just trying to like go through the timeline here because it's interesting that you went and you wanted to take this leap because you saw a problem in your current day-to-day and you're like, wait, my training's really good for this. So was that kind of the path that led you to where you are now?
So yes and no. I saw a lot of these gaps before I was even certified. So I did my instructional design program, my master's in instructional design at the same time that I did my certificate as well through FIT. So I did both simultaneously, but separately, knowing that I wanted to I had no clue I would be doing what I'm doing today. I didn't know exactly how I was going to marry those two things, but I knew that I really loved teaching and training others because I was already in kind of a trainer role. And so even then, that's when I was like started to get my wheels turning about how things could be more efficient for that organization, even before I was fully certified. And then, was seeing the gaps as I was practicing. I do this full time, but I still do some consulting in schools specifically. And then we have kind of an agency branch of our organization where we do remote supervision and some consultation and things like that. And so we're in touch with a lot of, it's important for me to stay very grounded in our field and what our field needs and communicating with other people.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's just like, it's a nice parallel, you know? Is the fact that you're able to utilize all of your training in the same field that you're certified for.
Yeah, right? I didn't know what it would look like, but yeah. And I think that that's been a constant theme throughout my career. I jumped around a lot as like in undergrad, I changed my major. Literally, I want to say it was 5 times. It was at least 4 times, like officially changed my major because I just have always I'm interested in a lot of things and pull together a lot of knowledge. I see parallels in how, things can work together. And so obviously even then I didn't know what I was doing. I was kind of scrambling, trying to figure out my path. And so even in doing the 2 programs at one time, like that was not the easy thing to do, but it was the thing that I knew would open doors or keep me open to learning, to growing. I didn't know what it would lead to, but that's been, back to my point, that's been kind of that theme for me that I think has really been what is successful about our organization too, is being open to those opportunities, seeing the opportunities and not doing the easy thing, but doing the thing that is going to set everyone up for success for the future.
I think this is a good way to wrap up our conversation is, can you give behavior analysts for people studying behavior analysis, advice that if they're interested in going into a career of instructional design, what's some advice that you would give them?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, really looking at what you want to do. So even in instructional design, there are so many different sub areas. You can use your instructional design skills with the clients that you're working with. So that could be an easy and great place to start, is really looking at how am I designing this instruction for my clients who are maybe children with autism or, some other population. How am I designing that instruction, or something like that to kind of get started. You don't need to make a full career switch before learning these things and learning how you can use them. But just kind of starting to think about how you would like to practice, because you can use it in that way. You can use it to train other behavior analysts or up and coming analysts. You can use it totally outside of the field. I have colleagues who are in corporate training and who are doing training in medical schools, and all of those different areas are areas that I think we can bring a lot to. And again, you don't need to have the answer, but starting to think about that will help you to distill kind of what you need to learn and where to go next. You don't need to get a degree in instructional design to learn instructional design. There are great communities and things out there. Amy Evans does a lot of Octave Innovation, does a lot of work on programming with learners, for example. And just look for colleagues within our field. Another great person to reach out to would be like Shannon Biaggi. She does a lot of work as well. So maybe reaching out to some of those folks that have their feet in both worlds, and looking to them for some resources and things like that. Because there's so much, even as we were talking about the theories, and there's so much to learn. It can be overwhelming to figure out where to start. And so finding a mentor or finding someone who can start getting you in the right direction would be a good place to start. And then last thing would be looking at some of the people who are already meaning people who are like published or bigger names that already have work in both areas. So again, Major, Tiemann and Markle would be another great place to start. And Guy Bruce has an instructional design book. Morningside, all of those folks that are really living in both of those worlds would be another good bridge to kind of just get started. And don't be afraid to just kind of start to dip your toes in. There's a lot to learn, but by just getting started, you'll kind of figure out where you want to go next.
All right. And Allyson Wharam too. Right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And reach out to me. I love connecting with people, and especially about this sort of stuff. I'm passionate about both things and bridging them. So yeah, definitely reach out.
Well, that's great. And then a little side disclaimer that my guess is that if you do go down this road and you get pretty far down into it and you really start to love it, that you'll want to redesign everything.
Yes, that's accurate. Yes. And start to see, it's the same thing as a behavior analyst, where you start to see like, well, if they just altered this thing or that thing. So everything that you do also, you'll start seeing it in the trainings you take, or, all of that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Allyson. It was nice to have you on the Motivity podcast. And thanks. And we'll wrap it up now. And thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate your time. Thanks.